Hey, deserving listeners, we have a very special guest with us today, Dr. K from HealthyGamer. He is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, psychiatrist, psychology individuals on the internet today, and I am quite honored to have you with me, Dr. K. Welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here, Dr. Honda.
So I want to get into a few things today. I want to talk about the genesis of your career and also of HealthyGamer itself. And I'm genuinely curious about all the things that HealthyGamer is doing these days, because it's a large organization doing a lot of good work. I also want to talk about your reprimand to your license. I think you represent a good example of someone who responded well to the information well before the reprimand even happened, actually. But first, I want to talk about UnitedHealthcare. What is your experience with UnitedHealthcare, if you have any?
So I've had some experience with UnitedHealthcare. You know, when we have patients, so this is like more when I was like at Mass General and McLean, where we sort of understood that some health insurances are harder to work with. Some health insurances, especially when it comes to mental health care, are like more or less prone to deny care. So generally speaking, you know, when we saw a patient with UnitedHealthcare, we knew that there was going to be somewhat of an uphill battle about sort of getting coverage and days extended and things like that if people needed longer inpatient stays. I did not interact with UnitedHealthcare directly very much. Sometimes I would hop on, a call to approve a certain kind of treatment with one of their, like in a more escalated fashion.
With the story that's been coming out, and you've observed, I'm guessing, the discourse public around UnitedHealthcare and the American healthcare insurance industry and the shooting of the CEO. Any thoughts on the matter?
You know, I do not think that assassinating someone in the street is a good idea. So I personally am a pretty big believer in ahimsa or nonviolence. So I don't think that violence is a good course of action. I also think, and this may be a little bit of a controversial take, so I also love history. And I also think that if you look at history, sometimes like violence is the only option that people feel like they have. So I think that it's easy for me to be pro nonviolence when I'm someone who has a relative amount of agency and safety in the world, right? So like if I have a problem, I have an education behind me. I can hire a lawyer if I need to. You know, I know how systems work. I'm well connected in terms of I have friends who are attorneys, friends who are in finance. So if I have some problem, I have ways of solving problems outside of violence. And even when I've worked with patients who have had homicidal ideation, things like that, I oftentimes find that from their perspective, they feel like they don't have any other choice, especially when we're talking about suicidality, homicidality. They kind of feel like all other avenues have been exhausted, which I think is also something that we see historically. So why do people have revolutions? Why do people go to war? Oftentimes, not always, oftentimes people feel like they're backed into a corner and they have no other choices. Now, whether this applies to the UnitedHealthcare shooting or not, I don't know. I think when I look at the response to the shooting, I think it speaks to a lot of people feel incredibly frustrated. I've certainly worked with a lot of patients who have been just absolutely destroyed by their experiences with insurance companies. So I've had, there's one patient that kind of comes to mind who was like a middle-aged gentleman who was like trying to figure out if they were having a panic attack or a heart attack. So they'd been to the emergency room a couple of times, ended up with gigantic bills. Things were like not covered because the person had a history of panic disorder. So the insurance company kind of like denied paying for the emergency visit. And so they were slapped with $20,000 to $30,000 bills for each one. It was an uphill battle. I think they had managed to kind of sort that out. But I remember kind of talking to them and them just describing, so I don't know if this is a panic attack, I can't afford another $30,000 bill. Is it a real heart attack? I don't know. They ended up waiting longer than they should have, and there was like more tissue damage than was good. So they were having a heart attack.
Oh my God.
And the really scary thing is, like, I remember talking to the patient and them sort of telling me, like, I was trying to figure out, is this a panic attack or a heart attack? Which, like, you as a patient don't know how to do, right? You can't tell. Like, the whole point of going to an emergency room is that we're the ones who are going to tell you, get an EKG, something like that, get enzymes and things like that, rule out a heart attack. And I think it just speaks to what a lot of people's experiences are. It's not as simple. It's not even once you get care, getting insurance to pay for it. It's like trying to decide for yourself if you can afford the risk of a denial of coverage. So I think a lot of people will deny themselves treatment because of their concerns around insurance and being able to pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Let's switch gears to, I'm curious, genuinely curious about how you started HealthyGamer, but give us a brief rundown of how and why you decided to become a psychiatrist.
Because I think my decision to become a psychiatrist actually starts long before I even went to med school. So I struggled a lot with technology addiction. Kind of growing up, I think I had other problems where technology became somewhat of an escape for me. It became a very unhealthy coping mechanism. I was like a gifted kid growing up, so I had a couple of like big challenges with that. The first is that I never developed study skills because school was always easy until it became impossible. So then when I couldn't like pick everything up fast, like sometime around high school, I remember one day like opening a textbook and being like, okay, I have to study. So I just opened the textbook and I started reading the first line. And then I did that for like maybe 15, 20 minutes. And I was like, my mind's not focusing. I'm not learning anything. So I struggled a lot and then was bullied a lot. So kind of fell into video games. Basically failed out of college. I had like less than a 2.0 GPA, was on academic probation, was kind of on my last chance. And my parents had tried all kinds of stuff. So they ended up suggesting I go to India, and I spent 3 months at an ashram, which is like a monastery, learning yoga and meditation, and then decided to become a monk. So I loved it so much because I was always confused, like why I couldn't control myself. Like I knew that studying was good. I knew that waking up and going to class was good. I knew that staying up until 6 a.m. playing video games was bad, but I just felt out of control. And so what I loved about India was I found a system that taught me how to control yourself. And I was like, this is amazing. So I decided I wanted to become a monk. That ended up not working out. I met my wife, the person who would become my wife. Got super interested in the science of what I was learning. So I ended up doing research at a couple of different institutions and then ultimately decided I wanted to learn about human beings and how they work. So from a medical perspective, decided to go to med school. It took me a couple of years to get in because my grades were really bad. And then was going to do like holistic oncology. So integrating complementary and alternative medicine that was evidence-based into oncologic treatment. But when you're in med school, they say like, who are the doctors that you think are like the coolest? Whereas your tribe, so a lot of med school is like discovering who your tribe is. And what I really found is I loved talking to patients, first of all, that a lot of medicine is no longer talking to patients. So if you become an oncologist, a lot of it is like reviewing lab work and imaging and stuff like that. And I think that stuff is super cool. But if you gave me a choice between spending 8 hours in front of a computer or 8 hours like with patients, I'd pick the people. And I love the mind as an organ. So I think it's like super exciting that we've sort of figured out a lot about the body. Like we know how the heart works, but when it comes to the mind, we really don't know for sure about a lot of stuff. So I also thought that like being a psychiatrist it was sort of like in a sense the hardest form of medicine. And I'm sure that my colleagues would disagree with that, and I'm happy to make counter arguments. But for me, it was the thing where your clinical judgment mattered the most because you have the least amount of like objective data, right? We have very little in terms of lab work. Sure, you can order like an MRI, but those are very rarely clinically useful for psychiatry. So I sort of fell in love with the profession that way because I liked the mind and I thought it was incredibly fascinating.
That's an interesting path. I will tell you that I also flirted with the idea of becoming a monk. Have we talked about this?
I think you mentioned it briefly, but I'd love to hear more.
Oh, well, it was in the 90s when I was getting my master's degree and I was very stressed out, and I would fantasize about an escape of becoming a monk in the Himalayas, in the mountains, in a cave, that I would give away all my possessions and I would have no attachments and I could just stare at the sunset and just be quiet. I just needed quiet. I just wanted peace, and I didn't want any obligations. I didn't want to have to write another paper. I didn't want to have to read another journal article. I didn't want to have to be responsible for more clients. I just wanted to stare at the horizon and have nothing expected of me. And I didn't want to have to buy any more things. I always think of that scene in the Fight Club when he's sitting on the toilet and he's going through the IKEA catalog and he's imagining all the new furniture and the coffee table and everything that he's putting into his apartment. And there was something about that scene because that movie came out around that just really resonated with me. It's just that materialism, adulting that kind of kicks in when you enter into your 20s, 30s, and just that rat race, keeping up with the Joneses, and you got to buy the right things and do the right things and say the right things, and you just see this treadmill like it never ends, and I just wanted to get off of that. When I graduated with my master's, the fantasy went away because I felt better as a clinician, and also I just didn't have the pressure of school anymore. And so I want to talk about HealthyGamer because I'm really curious, and I'm sure my listeners are curious too. Tell me about the beginning of HealthyGamer.
So I mean, it was really like a nights and weekends thing. So what happened is when I was a second-year resident, I got interested in technology addiction. And I was lucky enough to train at an institution that had just amazing teachers.
Had you ever prior thought about becoming a content provider?
No.
Okay.
Never crossed my mind. I had a conversation with the chief of psychiatry at Mass General, and he's a super cool guy, and he'll spend some one-on-one time with the residents, get to know us a little bit. So you maybe have one meeting with him a year. And so I was just asking him, what do you think about tech addiction? What's going on? And so no one was really, this is back in 2015, so people were knew that it was kind of a problem, but it's not how things are now. And so I thought that this was a huge problem. I knew I was struggling. And the really shocking thing is I'd kind of put my life together, but so many of the friends that I used to play, be a degenerate gamer with, we're talking 16-hour, 18-hour, 20-hour long hauls, every day for a week. They had not, right? So I was kind of one of the lucky ones where I had sort of escaped that trap, but they didn't have the resources, the support that I had. And I saw the problem getting worse. So I asked them, what do y'all think about this stuff? And they're like, oh yeah, it's a problem, but no one's really doing anything about it. So I started just talking to gamers, on the internet, and just asking them, what do you struggle with? What's going on?
So how? What venue?
Sometimes voice calls. Sometimes just, asking questions on Reddit, doing some back and forth, just really trying to learn a little bit about what's going on with people.
In a particular game, a game that you played casually?
Yeah, so I had friends, people on my friends list. And, we'd catch up from time to time. And I'd just be like, hey, what are you up to nowadays? Or they'd ask me, what are you up to nowadays?
What was your game? What was your game at the time?
Historically, it's been Dota 2. I don't remember what I was playing back then.
Okay.
So Dota 2 is a game that I've been playing for since 2012. But I play a lot of single player RPGs and story driven games and things like that too. So started talking to gamers and realizing this is a big problem. And then when I finished, I had a pretty good angle on a practice. So I was doing residential addiction treatment at two places. One was an insurance-based place, and one was a private pay place. The private pay place was really, really good. Also super kind of cushy. So I was super interested in addiction, and that was very clinical. I noticed a lot of my colleagues were scared of personality disorders or addictions. I think there are a lot of providers who will there are providers who specialize in those two things, oftentimes. And I just really liked working with those people. But going back to the technology addiction thing, so I had kind of two jobs. I had a private practice as well, which was really enjoyable. And then I realized though that I'm using all these skills to help people, but there's no shortage of psychologists and psychiatrists trying to, help entrepreneurs and CEOs and things like that. But no one was helping my people. So these are the degenerates. These are the 24-year-olds living in their mom's basement with a cycle of pornography and video games on a daily basis. Like that's what their life is. These people don't present for treatment, right? They don't, or if they present for treatment, they meet criteria for a mood disorder, 15-minute psychopharm visit, they get started on SSRI, they get sent home. Oftentimes they come from families that don't have a good understanding of mental health. They have, the reason they ended up that way is because they didn't get the right kind of support from their parents, which in turn is not their parents' fault because there's a lineage of trauma that has been passed down. So there's just this growing group of people that like no one was helping.
Yeah, that's my memory of you coming on the scene was I remember from the outside seeing your rocket rise and, being myself, having been around already for 10 years online and just seeing a new guy come on the scene and just go, wow. Yeah. I was like, there's this completely ignored group of people that Dr. K is speaking their language directly to them on Twitch in their language. He knows their world. He was in their world. And what a great service and what a wonderful thing that he's doing is bridging the gap, between these two worlds.
Yeah. So and it wasn't, I hadn't really thought about it in that way. I think you've given me a very positive spin. So in my mind, what it was is like, so I started working with gamers. So I charged a fair amount in my private practice, but also like 50% of the people that I saw were free. Oftentimes like gamers like this because, I felt like it was the right thing to do and no one else was there to help them. And what I discovered was that I wasn't doing a whole lot of psychotherapy with them. Like half of what I was doing was psychoeducation. They just didn't understand some of the basics about like how to meditate, right? So I'd have like a 60-minute appointment, which granted I'm not billing for, but 20 minutes of that would be like meditation instruction. And so I started streaming on Twitch because I asked myself one question, which is like, okay, if most of what I'm doing is psychoeducation, or let's say half of what I'm doing is psychoeducation, then can I do it publicly? And can people benefit from it? And that's why I started streaming. And I was stunned by how quickly we grew. So I had done my research and had realized that if I have 100 concurrent viewers in 1 year, that's a huge success. So I had looked at the data of what the rate of like subscriber gain and follower gain is. So I was like, okay, if at the end of 1 month I've got 5 people, that would be great if 5 people are watching. And that was a win for me, right? So instead of working with one person, if I'm teaching 5 people, like great, fantastic, done. Like that's a win.
And your hope was to help people without
just teach people
without any monetary gain to yourself.
Yeah, no, it was no money. Like there was no way. I mean, if you have 100, you probably make maybe $50 a month. I mean, so there was a period of time for 3 months where we were the fastest growing stream on Twitch. So I had never expected that level of objective growth. But I absolutely, and I think this is part of the reason the reprimand ended up the way that it did, which was, no restrictions on my license. We talked to the board about, hey, do we need to stop this? Do we need to take anything down? They said no. So I had prepared on the back end for making sure what I was doing was okay, right? So we a lot of people thought that, because it was, so what I ended up doing is having conversations with people. And really my goal was, okay, like we'll have a conversation about whatever you want to talk about. I'll teach you whatever stuff that I've learned that may apply to you. And I really loved listening to people's stories. So I think a lot of what people lose is that there's a big difference between psychotherapy and what we do online, right? So if you think about...
Totally. Yeah, I guess we should get into the reprimand. But
yeah,
before doing that, so in the first year, it grew exponentially, right? And then you're referencing that you would start talking to people on live stream, because there's a lot of my audience that won't know the Twitch universe, and I'm barely aware of it myself, but you would have guests on, and occasionally you would have very famous gamers as guests, but you'd also just have non-famous people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To provide context and to do a kind of in-person Q&A around the issues that were very relevant to the person you're talking to, but also to the audience. And it was very helpful. And you did this a lot. I don't know how much detail you want to get into this, but like the relationship that you had with the individual that had to do with the reprimand.
Yeah, so I think let's talk about a couple of other things, and then we'll get to that. So I think the other thing you were sort of asking, how did we start? And so what I sort of stumbled into was that the need was even greater. Like, I knew the statistics, and the statistics were scary. So around then, like maybe 5 to 10% of people, like the prevalence of video game addiction was around 5 to 10%. This was back in like 2015, 2016. So I knew there was a huge problem, and my goal was to like educate these people, teach them how to meditate, right? So do some like stuff like that, which is not clinical care. And then what HealthyGamer has become since then is just this, is like the existing systems are not working. And I think the UnitedHealthcare thing kind of comes in there too, where what I've started to realize and what we've become now is that like the face of mental challenges, I wouldn't even call it mental illness. The face of mental challenges is evolving incredibly rapidly. And we don't have the institutions or infrastructure in place to deal with this rapid evolving of people's mental struggles. And I think at the top of the list is that mental health is more than the treatment of mental illness. So we have a ton of gyms, but we don't have many places where you can like buff your mental health, right? We don't have stuff like that. There's some stuff around diet and nutrition and things like that. So the world is moving forward in the right way, but there are all kinds of like societal problems that it's not clear. It's no one's job to fix. So there's like a mating and dating crisis. Like fertility rates are like an all-time low, like historic low in South Korea. I heard recently that the Chinese government is like paying people to have babies. Right, but if we really look at the root of this, sure, maybe there's like economic impacts, but I think a lot of that is like mental in nature. People are unwilling. People don't know how to communicate. People don't know how to connect. So there's like stuff going on where I feel like people need to understand how they function as human beings. Why do people ghost me? How do I respond to ghosting? So it's not even like focused really on mental illness, like the work that we do. We'll talk about mental illness, and there's a couple of other, things that is part of our mission is destigmatizing mental illness. And this is something that everyone says we should do, but no one is responsible for doing. So what we've really found is that the world needs to change, or my belief, this now, if you want to talk about arrogance, you can label me arrogant here. I believe that the world needs to adapt. And I think a lot of people are doing it. So I'm not saying we're the only ones. I think you're doing it. I think, a lot of people are doing it. We're just doing our little slice of contribution at trying to bridge the gap between what is available and what people need.
Yeah, when I started making content and found it to be very fulfilling and fun and meaningful, and a lot of people were craving this, I started to tell colleagues that they should, make a YouTube channel, start a podcast. And I just thought that by now, in 2024, 2025, that there would be thousands of known figures that we could name because of just how easy it is and how fun it is, how fulfilling it is, and the need that's out there. And every year I find that it's not happening. You joining was a welcome element to this, but yeah, as you say, there's not enough of us. And as you also say, like, we supposedly as a field in psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy, we're trying to make the world a better place, but so few of us are actually going online and trying, And
there are good reasons for that, I think. Yeah. So I think it's dangerous to be public. We really enjoy one-on-one interactions. And I think like becoming a content creator, I'm sure like there's a grind to it. It's really challenging, demands a lot. The internet is a fickle audience, so I think it's really hard. And then you can also, people will be upset with you because the moment that you get a public persona, and the more that your public persona rises, I think the more people will start taking shots at you.
Yeah. Anyway, well, let's get to I want to I want to get to the point where we're talking about your response to the reprimand. So
Sure.
can you tell us, was his name Reckful? Was that his name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we did a series of collabs with a guy named Reckful. And so the first collab was like relatively spontaneous, which is pretty common on Twitch. So Twitch, what'll happen is different content creators will interact with each other. And so we talked to Reckful. We did 6 interviews.
And for those who don't know, Reckful is his gamer name on Twitch, and he was one of the bigger Twitch streamers and had a lot of fans. And so
Absolutely.
when he was being interviewed by you in that first, or not interviewed, well, I don't know what sort of word, just a conversation between friends, I think is technically how it was. And he ended up talking about his traumas and his mental health and his suicidality eventually within those 6 meetings or friend conversations. He was talking about his traumas and his struggles and his suicidality and his sadness, and you would cry, and you would listen. And so how would you characterize those conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is I'm not sure. So a couple of things. So just to kind of finish the story too, Reckful later committed suicide. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and I think, a lot of people struggled a lot during the pandemic. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because he still has a right to privacy. So we don't, I'm not going to talk about what happened with him. And so after he committed suicide, someone filed a complaint with the Medical Board of Massachusetts alleging that I was responsible for his death in some way.
And do you know who it was? That
Yeah, so I'm not going to comment on that either.
But it wasn't like a family member. It was
No.
It was an observer, a fan who observed the situation from afar.
Yeah. So and so they filed a complaint. So then we went through this process with the Massachusetts Medical Board about, what is it that we're doing? Is it therapy? Is it not therapy? Were we responsible for something? And then after about a 2-year investigation, which was quite thorough, we were happy to cooperate with. The board basically came to the conclusion. So I got reprimanded. It was something called a consent order. Y'all can read it. It's publicly available. There are a couple of important points about it. The first is that there was a formal disciplinary action of a reprimand. And the substance of the reprimand was not that it was in malpractice or that I was doing therapy or anything like that. It was that what I did was, I think, something about made the profession look bad. So that there's a standard that physicians have that if we do something that's not even related to medicine, if we do something that reflects poorly upon the profession of medicine, we can be reprimanded for it. And I think the board's finding was reasonable. So I think some people looked at what we did and thought that this doesn't look okay. And I think that's a very, very reasonable conclusion to have.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight to the listeners the humility and wisdom and vulnerability that you're even talking about this, but also from my distance perspective, before even meeting you, observing your reaction to the reprimand was very commendable. I don't know what I would have done. I think I would have had elements of what your reaction was and is, but I think it would have been emotionally really hard on me, and I think I would have gotten defensive, or I would have just shut the whole thing down out of humiliation or something. Not that it should be humiliating. It just, for us clinicians, we tend to be way overreactive to these kinds of things, because of, I don't know, just a black or white way of thinking about this sort of thing. But I will say that it's really commendable that as you were going through this, you're just like, hey, okay, what can I learn from this? This isn't great, but what can I learn from it? And I want to contrast this with another famous clinician online, Jordan Peterson, who had a licensing sanction because of his homophobic statements that he was making on Twitter. And essentially the Canadian province version of a licensing board told him that due to this harm that he was enacting on the public, he needed to spend I think one day going to a educator about how clinicians can use social media. It was just a class. It wasn't, they weren't saying, we're going to take your license away. They weren't saying, we're going to force you not to tweet anymore or change your mind about actually, it wasn't homophobic. It was transphobic statements, right? About Elliot Page. And Jordan Peterson's very public response was, this is bullshit. This is a matter of free speech, which it's not. And he fought it. I don't even know if he ever complied. I don't know the story beyond that. And I just want to contrast Jordan Peterson's, because he had sanctions put on him in a very reasonable way, very understandable way. And the reaction was pretty milquetoast, actually, because I personally think his license should have been stripped, or at least he should have been put on probation. I mean, a transphobic public statement. He also accused the physician of malpractice without knowing anything about the situation. So I think that their reaction was extremely charitable to him, and he still couldn't handle the situation and represented, us as mental health clinicians poorly. You, on the other hand, had the complete opposite reaction. You're just like, okay, I agree with them, and what can we learn?
Yeah, so I think there's like some context there that's also like important. So I don't know if this makes sense. The medical board is not my enemy. So one of the things that I think a lot of people get upset about is like, so I think a lot of people don't know this, but when we were doing this work, we asked a ton of people, hey, is this okay? We reached out to several professional organizations, sought guidance.
But who would you call? Because this has been a concern of mine for 16 years, that there's so few experts when it comes to this sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So what I saw was like, hey, the world is kind of falling apart. Like, mental health is a mess. Who is responsible for this? No one's responsible for it, right? So a clinician has a particular responsibility to their 40 patients that they see in psychotherapy every week. A medical board has a certain responsibility. The Department of Public Health has a certain responsibility, but an insurance company has a certain responsibility. A hospital has a certain responsibility, but everyone is kind of doing their jobs. And this mental health crisis happened on everyone's watch. And so it's easy to kind of say, like, they're at fault, but I don't think so, because they were doing their job, right? So I think what happened is mental health, the mental health crisis got bigger than the scope of what everyone's jobs can handle. So we saw this problem and we tried to do something about it, right?
What you're talking about is ethical decision making. What's the benefit versus the risk and versus the harm? And if there's this huge need and there's this huge benefit of actually being an online clinician, doing things, demonstrating mental health and helping people, and it is this huge benefit to society, and there's a risk and maybe even questions of possible harm, then that's the context. It doesn't mean that we just do it. It just means that's the context.
Absolutely. So, and I think we reached out to a professional organization who said, hey, I'm doing this. Can y'all please guide us? Like, is this okay? Is this not okay? The answers that we got were pretty similar. They were like, this really isn't our wheelhouse. And some of them even responded with saying, like, commending, much like you. So they were like, we commend you for taking this ethical approach and stuff like that. So we got that feedback, but basically everyone was kind of like, we don't really know. Don't break the law. Make sure you stay within our existing codes of ethics. And that's the best guidance that we can give you.
Did you present that data to the board when?
Absolutely.
Right,
absolutely.
That shows due diligence.
Yeah. And then the other thing that we sort of realized is no existing body could tell us this is okay or not okay. And so we also went about finding, looking for a scientific advisory board. So we built a scientific advisory board that is very they're really good in the sense that they will give us real feedback.
So,
right. So
all this was before the suicide?
No, after the suicide, I think, but before the board complaint, a couple of years later. Yeah. So as we continued to grow, we realized, we looked for people to say, okay, is this okay, not okay? When we couldn't get a clear answer from several professional organizations, we started to think, okay, we need to find people to make sure that we're doing, that can go through what we're doing and give us feedback. This is okay, this is not okay. It's a collection of different professionals medical doctors, one medical ethicist, people who are content creators, people who are coaches, people who are psychologists. So it's a collection of different people, and we'll basically ask them for guidance. Hey, we want to stream. What should be our stream procedures? We're thinking about doing this. What do you think about this? And they'll basically give us feedback about we believe this is okay for these reasons. We believe this is not okay for these reasons.
This is a model that we've been using in medicine and in psychology for decades when it comes to like research or a program evaluation. And was the suicide a factor in the decision to do this?
I don't know. So I think it was just more like, okay, as this is growing, I don't remember what exactly was a factor. It was just more that the way that I kind of remember it is we were asking people for guidance. We were not getting sufficient answers. And so we realized we need someone looking over our shoulder to make sure in the best possible way that we don't make mistakes. Let's just talk about what the board found and didn't find. So in some sense, so the board basically, or the reprimand was for doing things that reflected poorly on the profession, which I think is fair enough, that some people could look at what I did and say, this looks bad. Fair enough.
And bad in that, and I don't know, but my assumption was that, and I don't know if they clarified, but it reflected bad on the profession in that it kind of looked like therapy, even though they determined it was clear that it was not therapy.
Yeah, that's correct. So we'll get to that in a second. So I think that's fair. The second thing is that I think a lot of people, so while some people think that what we did looks bad, I suspect that the majority of people really like what we do. And that's the feedback that we get, right? So even to this day, many people will say like that conversation with Reckful helped me so much.
Right. And in my reaction video before you and I met to the reprimand, based on the reprimand itself and other information I could find, which wasn't much, that was one of the points I brought up, is that when it comes to ethical decision making, we make decisions based on the benefit versus the risk, and it's a conversation. So just because there's a risk there, that there was a risk talking to him, in that it could look like therapy, or he could be harmed by the conversation because it could open a Pandora's box or something, so that there's a risk and that's recognized. But the benefit to him and also the literal millions of people watching was very possible and was realized. A lot of people benefited from those conversations.
Yeah, so I think that's what we've kind of found in this journey and what we've become is that a lot of people, get, 15 million people watch us every month. And I suspect that we're helping those people in some way.
Because people really looked up to Reckful and didn't know that he had these issues. And to see him model to people, to be given the opportunity to model for people how to take care of himself, because at the time he was, that's a huge benefit.
Yeah, so I wouldn't comment on that, right? So what people knew about him, that's not my place to say. So I think kind of going back to the nuts and bolts of it, like I think some people, fair enough, this looks bad. I think for the majority of people, at least the feedback that we've gotten, that's not the case. And I think that's true for the majority of our content. I think a couple of other things that you kind of alluded to. So the board did not believe that what we did was the practice of psychotherapy or clinical medicine. They placed no restrictions on my license or no probation or no education or things like that. And no restrictions on content either. So do we need to take these things down? Can we continue doing this? And so none of that stuff. So basically it was kind of, there were no, I'm not aware of any like practical consequence, like no fines or anything, no restrictions or probation or anything like that. And then the other thing that the board found, which I think is important, is that they found that I behaved in I think provided pretty standard of care, kind of following standard procedures in terms of like referral for, in this particular case for this person, for like appropriate care at appropriate times or something like that. I don't remember exactly what the details of the board thing are. And so I think the other thing is that I think they reviewed hundreds of videos that we had done. And the reprimand is focused on these 6 interviews with Reckful or conversations with Reckful. And I think that it's also like important to think a little bit about when this was. So this was like back in 2019. And so people weren't aware of a mental health crisis the way that we are today. 5 years ago, the world was pre-pandemic. It was a very different place. And I think now people have really like wisened up to like how big of a problem this is and how the existing, I mean, like literally, dude, like we started this conversation with the CEO of a health insurance company getting gunned down in the street. Like something is really messed up in the world right now. We have fertility crises. We have, an increasing rise in suicidality, like not only ideation, but increased suicide. We're seeing a really super scary gender equality in mental illness. I know this sounds wild, but like I think, it used to be that eating disorders were primarily women, and they're still primarily women, but we're seeing a rise in body dysmorphia in eating disorders in men. We're seeing addictions used to be 3 to 4 times as likely in men as women. We're seeing that even out as well. So we're seeing like a whole scale, like the world is kind of falling apart when it comes to like mental health and like mental illness. So this was like kind of 5 years ago. And the way that I kind of view the board and still do is that I want to do this work. I think it's important to do this work. I think we need to continue doing this work. And we want to do it in the safest way possible. And so the board is there for a reason. They're not the enemy. They're my friend. They're my ally. It's their job to, first of all, protect the public, right? And secondly, it's their job to help me figure out what is okay and what is not okay. So I'm actually grateful. You were wondering, how I deal with it. Like, I'm really glad because we finally had someone, we asked so many people, we finally had someone go through everything and tell us, is this okay or not okay? And so we provided a lot of materials to them about, these communications that we had, the scientific advisory board, which, as you mentioned, is we did before there was a board complaint, right? So we recognized that we need to improve our process as much as possible. We need to try to create as much oversight as possible, all this kind of stuff.
What was that change? What change did you implement?
So many changes. So there's just all kinds of changes that we continue to implement to this day. We just look at our process and we'll ask ourselves, okay, what can be better?
I'll just say for myself, having been a content provider for 16 plus years and having been a clinician who teaches ethics and is very concerned with representing our field well and not harming anyone. The average clinician that I know is completely paranoid about committing an ethical violation. And so if I had a public complaint about me, even if things went extremely well, I would have so much anxiety about it. It would really challenge me. I would be ashamed of myself. I would be angry. I would be worried. I'd be sad. I would be up and down. And I know a lot of clinicians who would have a similar reaction. What was your reaction?
I think it depends on how you look at it, right? So like I said, we've been committed to continuing this work and continuing it as safely as possible, which is why we've made the changes over time and will continue to make changes. I think the board stuff was honestly very relieving. Like, it was stressful at the time, but now we know, right? So now, like, everyone who's been concerned that we're unethical or we're this or that, like, someone has gone through everything. Private communications, stuff related to my clinical practice, which is completely separate from HealthyGamer. Someone has gone through everything, and they have concluded that what we're doing in those 6 interviews between 2019 and 2020 looked bad, and that there's no problems with anything since then. That what we did was not malpractice. We weren't responsible for a suicide, did not constitute the practice of medicine. So I think it's very reasonable to have the reaction of like feeling super anxious and stuff like that. And we're careful. And I think part of the reason that there was no probation or anything like that is because I imagine the board was able to see that we have a lot of like good, ethically determined like policies and procedures in place. And so I think going forward, it's really recognizing, like, I feel great that the board went through everything and basically told us, hey, you did 6 interviews between 2019 and 2020, 5 years ago, and these looked bad, was their conclusion, as I understand it.
Not an ethical violation in terms of having harmed the public or the individual, but it represents the profession.
It reflects poorly on the profession, or some people believe it reflects poorly on the profession, which I think is fair enough, right? Like, fair. I think that's very reasonable. And that's their job.
Meaning that they wished you would have been more what?
I don't know. I mean, so that's the other thing, is I don't speculate on, they said what they were going to say, and that's what they're going to say.
Yeah.
So interpretations and speculations are things that I tend to steer clear of. So, yeah, and I think, like, kind of going forward, I think it's like really good that we can continue this work. So that was kind of the most important thing to me, is that we thought what we were doing was okay. It's really good to have someone go through everything and basically say what you're doing is, like, you don't have to stop or restrict what you're doing. And so I still think the work that we're doing is incredibly important. It's becoming more important. I also think there's another really, really good sort of silver lining from this, which you kind of mentioned, who do you talk to? So now these issues are being determined, right? So people like you mentioned, Jordan Peterson, and so he went through a process. I went through a process. I understand there was like a dermatologist or someone who was like live streaming their actual clinical work, or a plastic surgeon or someone who was like live streaming their patients, right? They, I think, lost their license. I don't know the details. But I think we're trying to figure out, as a profession of medical professionals, how do we exist in a public world? So what is okay? What is not okay? My take is that the clinical practice that I do and the work that I do at HealthyGamer is completely separate. There's no cross referral or anything like that. If someone comes into my clinical practice, they will never be a stream guest. And then basically the opposite is also true, right? So when someone approaches us and asks us if someone has been a stream guest and they're looking for a therapist, we'll refer them out. Because, we're not allowed to have dual relationships. There may be some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, like, that's how we do things.
Yeah, I explored that particular ethical dilemma in a white paper that I wrote 4 or 5 years ago, in the effort of writing what I think was the first white paper on this topic, which was clinicians in psychology and psychotherapy using, or I guess mental health in general, using social media to make content. And the issue of dual relationship is not necessarily a violation. It's just a matter of case by case. But we can't stop our patients from watching our content or listening to our content. How do we manage it, though, and what kinds of measures do we put in place to mitigate or to lower risk, including making sure that when we're making content, we don't say anything that could harm any past, present, or future client or patient of ours. But I explored all that, and it gets interesting. But to just avoid the whole thing means none of us will ever be online, and none of us will ever be given an opportunity to educate and help people.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't see a solution, which is maybe my ignorance, but I don't see a solution for the mental health crisis that does not involve clinicians having some degree of public involvement. I just don't think that's like, because right now, basically what I see is that we're using social media to damage our mental health, and we're not using social media to help our mental health, or not nearly as much.
Plus all the charlatans who aren't clinicians and don't have a licensing board to answer to and haven't taken a course on ethics and don't have an ethical code, they are just freely saying all sorts of bullshit online. And so if we're not going to say anything, then they are going to rule the narrative and influence people.
Yep. And I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's really interesting, right? Because like other people are way more unrestricted than we are in terms of offering mental health advice. I saw a study recently that 95% of the information about ADHD on TikTok is wrong.
I'm surprised it's that low.
And so now the question becomes when there's like, I don't think it's like malicious misinformation. I think it's just people saying, oh, if you've got TikTok, if you forget where your keys are. I mean, you've got ADHD if you forget where your keys are. So now we've got this other problem where like people are learning incorrect information about their mental health and mental illness. And that, I imagine, hurts them. I don't know how, miseducating someone about a particular diagnosis can possibly be good. So I think we as clinicians have to do something. Like we have to offer some kind of high quality information about mental health.
Yeah, and it's well known in education, in graduate schools, that clinical examples are an excellent way to convey information and ground all the academic criteria in a real case. And sometimes that involves talking to people who actually exist, or about people who actually exist. We have all the ethical considerations of confidentiality and harming individuals to consider, and there are well understood for decades how to manage that in terms of obscuring identities, making composite examples, that kind of thing, getting consent, and also making sure that you're getting consent for someone that knows what they're getting into, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, all that. Well, I want to conclude by, I'm just curious everything that HealthyGamer is doing right now, because you just said that you're also helping to coach content providers, which I didn't know that you did. So can you just list off all the stuff that HealthyGamer is doing right now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we do three main things. We do content, community, and coaching. So content is like our streaming and YouTube channel where we provide education and entertainment relating to the fields of mental health.
And is it only you that makes the content? Are you the only one on camera?
Well, yes and no. I mean, so we'll have guests like yourself, right? So, and I think one of the things that we're realizing is I've been doing this for 5 years and I'm not an expert in everything. And that our platform infrastructure, like you mentioned, like Kruti and the other people that you've been talking to, right? Like, so there are people like yourself who know way more than I do about any number of topics. So now our kind of next phase that we're really considering, because we're really interested in, our mission is to educate the internet about mental health. So how can we support other voices and other forms of expertise? Like I learned a ton from, our conversation about like I wish I had that lecture. I wish I had used a teacher when I was in residency. What is the difference between avoidant personality disorder and schizoid personality disorder, right? So like those kinds of things like are really fantastic. So I think HealthyGamer is bigger than Dr. K and absolutely needs to be bigger than Dr. K because I don't know everything. So people on the internet have this perception that also if they could be in my clinical practice, they would be cured, but no, right? That's just a mess of idealization that I don't want to deal with. They're going to be disappointed. I'm going to feel terrible. So I'm a decent clinician. I'm a decent educator. I think there are other people out there who are just as good, if not way better than me in both of those dimensions. So the content is not, hopefully, not just Dr. K. And if you know anyone who, wants to educate the public and is really competent, like, please let us know.
And so we've talked about this before off camera, that you want to develop relationships, not with just occasional guests, but like ongoing individuals who would provide content that they would drive themselves that would be in areas that you aren't an expert on.
Yeah. So the way I would describe it is if you get someone who's a good teacher, right, there's a certain amount of like support we can provide. And I think one-offs are kind of tough because then you can develop as a creator. So the more that a creator practices, the better they're going to get. And so it's really figuring out like, okay, who, like you're a great example, like, so much about personality disorders. It's something that you've been teaching, been practicing for years and years and years. And so if there are other people out there who have expertise to share, like by all means, right? We're all for that. It's not about the greater glory of Dr. K. I'm just one voice. I'm good at like certain things. And then there's lots of other people out there who have great channels. And so, or don't have great channels. And
yeah, I commend. So you make your content that is sometimes topic based and sometimes Q&A based and sometimes
Interview based.
interview based.
We still do interviews.
And then you also have a wing of HealthyGamer that is helping people to start their own content provision.
Yeah, so we're kind of exploring that, right? So it's a challenge that we're trying to overcome, which is, okay, if our challenge is we want to create mental health content that is really high quality for all of the topics that are important to people, I'm not an expert in it all. How do we solve that problem? That's where we're at.
So the coaching of the content providers are for people to make content on their own or with you?
Oh no. So we also do. So we have content, right? So we'll do educational mental health content in live stream or video format. Then we also have community. So we have a pretty robust community of maybe anywhere between 50 and 150,000 active people who will set up community events like clean your room on Sunday or meditate. We're going to meditate together. We're going to go out and touch grass. We'll create community challenges. We also have these events called like Social Sandbox, where people come on and like practice. Like we had a beautiful event this past February for Valentine's Day where 200 people came to like practice asking someone out on a date. Because it's kind of crazy if you think about it. You know, you really like this person, you want them to say yes, but the first time you ask them out on a date, like it matters, right? You don't get a chance to practice this skill. So we'll do stuff like that, which I think is also in line with our mission, which is that educating yourself about, whatever, narcissistic personality disorder is not a substitute for building the skills. And these are not even like CBT skills. These are like, how do you ask someone out on a date?
Yeah.
And so that's the second piece of what we do. We'll have like some community challenges, and then we offer coaching. So coaching is a non-clinical intervention that uses some evidence-based foundation. So things like motivational interviewing and things like that to really create behavioral change. So the way that I kind of see therapy, and this is also, we could have offered clinical services. We could have gone down that route, but I don't think that clinicians are like bad, right? There's plenty of clinicians out there that are really good. What's missing is if you look at what clinicians do, we're really trained on pathology. So how to get someone who is ill back to normal. But that same skill set of behavioral change can be used to take someone who's at baseline and help them achieve way more. So this is kind of the positive psychology, branch. And the coaches that I originally learned from who were at McLean Hospital were basically therapists who developed into coaches. So they started doing a lot more like corporate work and things like that.
How many coaches are they employees of HealthyGamer?
They're contractors. So yeah.
And how many do you have?
About 140.
And how many clients are being served?
I think about 3,000 a month.
Wow.
Maybe.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is amazing. I mean, it makes sense because people will reach out to me and say, can I hire you, or do you know someone? And I'm always like, it's a long time ago. I just said, I couldn't even begin to have a list of people in every jurisdiction that they're in. So I just say, here's the instructions of how to typically find a good therapist. But given your platform, yeah, I could see how. Absolutely.
So I think it's like, there's community events, which are great. There's content, which is great. But then there's a certain value to like working with people. And if you're struggling so we do like content creator coaching. So like, just to give you an example of that, like, so, there are other people who are content creators who struggle with being a content creator. Now, this is not like diagnosis based. It's not like they have OCD or whatever, but they're on a very rigorous upload schedule. They feel burnt out. They don't know how to access their best creativity, right? So those are the kinds of issues: burnout, imposter syndrome. These are not clinical entities. And so we have a really good methodology to help people. We worked with like Twitch and worked with their top 125 content creators, and helped them, perform. And we even will do, you were asking about like, what else we do. So we have a research arm. We're running, I think, 6 IRB approved studies right now. We also do a lot of collaborations. So we've done collaborations with the United Nations, with the Office of the Surgeon General, where hopefully we'll have something that we're trying to build out with the WHO. So I think there's a lot of there are a lot of entities out there, existing entities that don't have this expertise on technology addiction, on what's going on with like young people nowadays.
So the research that's funded by HealthyGamer, and you're not expecting to get any money out of that typically.
No. So that's just our internal. So when we develop something, we want to know, like we need an objective way to test what we're doing. Right. So just to give you an example, one of our studies is on a measure of video game addiction that includes positive effects of playing video games. So if you look at the research, video games were part of people's resilience during the early stages of the pandemic. Video games can be used as a coping strategy. They can be used as a way to form connections with other people. But if you look at all of the existing instruments that measure video game addiction, they're all focused negatively, right? So we were trying to develop an instrument that can you reduce the negative impacts of video gaming while preserving the positive impacts of video gaming.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, that's been a complaint of mine as well, not only with technology or video game addiction, but in other fields as well, other issues. It's analogous to me with if you're talking about people who work out, like they run and they lift weights, and you only asked questions about how sore they were or how much time it took, how expensive the equipment was, and you didn't talk about the health benefits and the psychological benefits and everything. Because with working out, you will accept the bad because you get the good. And with video game, and you can become addicted to working out such that you can have too many negative effects, right? So with video games, similarly, there's a lot of good things that can happen. And maybe there's some bad things, like if you just had questions around, have you ever decided not to go to a function in person because you wanted to stay home and play video games? And it's like, ooh, that's automatically a bad thing. Well, sometimes playing video games with your friends at home is the preferred thing to do, and that's okay. So so you have to ask all the questions to get a holistic picture. So that's pretty amazing. Wow, I mean, involved with WHO and UN, that is just that's just amazing.
Yeah, so I think we're and that's kind of why we're the size we are, right? Because we're trying to do a lot of different stuff. And then, the last thing that we recently just got certain approvals for and things like that. So we have a clinical education arm. So the other thing that we've sort of stumbled into is that a lot of these problems, so I don't know you're involved in education, so you may know this, but the average therapist that goes through training will have a total of 0 hours on anything related to technology addiction as part of their formal curriculum. So now the question becomes, and then clinicians are they're doing a good job. I think a lot of really good clinicians basically take a skill set that works for other things and adapt it to technology addictions, right? So everyone's sort of figuring it out on their own, but there is an immense value to being formally, when we put together all the research and educating people in that. So I built CMEs for the American Psychiatric Association in the past. So now we're doing a lot of education around technology addiction and really trying to empower clinicians so that when a patient comes into your office, so that people know more about. So for example, video game addiction has a 30% comorbidity with marijuana addiction. So if someone comes in and they say, I play too many video games, you should assess for marijuana use, right? So you should ask again or whatever. So there's just a lot of really high quality information that's out there, which hasn't entered the pipeline of standard education. And you know what it's like to be a clinician. You're busy enough with your patients and your billing and all that kind of stuff. You have some kind of stock CMEs or continuing educations that you do. But if you really want to understand how to help someone with pornography addiction, where do you go to learn that? Because porn addiction is a completely different beast. So as these addictions are evolving, we have to keep up as clinicians with how can I help these people in the most meaningful way?
Yeah, I'm jealous because as an academic, the typical mindset or approach is what you are doing, which is collaboration and research and trying to push the clinical work forward and creating organizations and, reaching out to the political organizations and that sort of thing. And I, as the CEO, I guess, of Psychology in Seattle, of our corporation, get so overwhelmed with the chaos. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in your shoes, to have all of these, now I'm guessing you have people that are taking care of all this sort of stuff, but it's still associated with you and your wife, right? So how do you manage all that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the crazy thing, Kirk, is like, so we've talked to so many people like yourself, right? I mean, like you've been grinding at this. And I think the key thing is that if we work together, right? So like you can do the stuff that you're best at and I can do the stuff that I'm best at. And there's so many great content creators out there who, just because, life gets in the way, like you've got patience and all that kind of stuff. I think it's like we can work together and share like infrastructure and support each other. I think another big thing that I'm kind of like a big believer in, which is maybe like a little bit of a controversial statement, but I think there's a big problem in academia because teaching, so if you are like a professor, right, you're not rated on your teaching. So academic medical centers, for example, will rarely hire professors for their teaching capability. It's usually about research dollars. And I think that makes sense in a lot of ways, because if you have the best researcher on a topic, they are the most knowledgeable. But that doesn't make them the best at disseminating that knowledge.
In fact, a lot of times it's an indication that they're not going to be good at it because their skill set is very different than that. They're good at designing methodology and grinding away at data gathering and doing their math right, writing a report, collaborating with other researchers. They're not good at standing in front of the podium. And
absolutely, right? So, and I think like Khan Academy is a really great example of this, that when you have just one really great teacher, the number of students that I've had as patients who were at prep schools, they're at these prep schools that charge, really high fees, and they're still learning half of their material from Khan Academy. Like my daughter got some homework recently where like the teacher was like, watch this video on Khan Academy. And so now if we're really talking about like educating clinicians, like great. Like, I mean, if you're the world foremost expert in whatever, and I'm really lucky because I trained in an institution where you had research experts, but people who are also really good at teaching. And I've seen like what, how much of a difference that makes. So that's why we're really trying to, there's another layer of this, which is that if we want to make an impact in the world, we need to equip therapists with the latest in education and hopefully find pretty compelling, non-dry CMEs that will sort of help them, CEs that'll help them do that.
So let me ask you just one more question. A day in the life of Dr. K, given all of these things that are happening, and I guess your wife as well, because my impression is that she has her hands in a lot of the things on a daily basis more than you do. What is it like?
So a day is not very similar. So now I've gotten into almost like breaking up weeks. So I'll have 1 week where I have a minimum of meetings. I will focus on scripting and filming content for like 6 hours a day for 5 days in a row. When I'm done with the content, I usually eat something, I take a nap, and then I'll have clients or patients in the afternoon, late evening.
And do you do online patients or is it in person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, online. And so that's like 1 week. I usually travel for about 1 week out of the month now. 1 week will be like more like standard like meetings, and maybe I'll have some streams and stuff like that kind of sprinkled in.
Do you have organization Healthy Gamer meetings where there's like strategy and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So all that kind of stuff.
And your wife is more daily involved in all of the other elements of Healthy Gamer?
Yeah, so she like runs the show.
I imagine she's in charge of the head of the coaching unit and in charge
of...
Yeah,
so I used to be more involved with that. And I'm still involved specifically with like coaching in a lot of ways, but I think there's like some things that I'm involved in, and then I think all the other stuff, I mean, she's involved in everything because she's running the show. So she's involved in content and coaching and community and product and meeting with devs, and she kind of does it all.
So she kind of knows what's happening at all
Absolutely.
times and
Yeah.
is
And
coordinating and making sure everyone knows what they need to know.
I was CEO for like 6 to 8 months, and I suck at the job.
Yeah,
Like,
I can't. I would be terrible too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting skill set. I think CEOs get a bad rap, but it's just like anything else. Like, you can have a really good CEO or you can have a really lousy CEO.
Yeah, I was program director at my university for a while, and it's kind of like being a CEO, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's so much harder. I thought, oh, I'm the boss man now. I can do whatever I want, and everyone has no. In a weird way, I felt way more powerless as a program director than I did as an underling to the program director.
So it's interesting because over the last 5 years, the number of people that answer to me has gone down, and the number of people that I answer to has gone up. Right. And I think that's good. Like, I'm a resource, and other people have their, domains, and that's what I'm there for.
Wow. I had no idea. I knew that HealthyGamer had grown as an organization. I'd heard tell of the coaching wing, but I didn't realize it was that big. And I also didn't know that you were doing your own research and that you were collaborating with these world organizations. Where do you see HealthyGamer being in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows? I really don't think about what's coming 5 years down the road. So I think kind of just like we started with, it's about actions and trying. So we're not trying to go anywhere. The main North Star for us is when we see a problem, we try to fix it. So you mentioned, like, you get calls, right, from all these people that were like, hey, can you work with me? And so one of the things that we realized is that if you really look at the mental health crisis, one way to look at it is it's a workforce problem. And so if it's a workforce problem, I had worked with a lot of peer coaches, actually, when I was doing addictions work, and I saw how effective they were, right? It was a little bit of an ego bruise that this person who basically has a 2-month certificate, but really has a lot of lived experience, can do more, not more, but a different thing for a patient than I can, and in many ways more than I can, as a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. And so, but once I stopped and really thought about that, I realized, like, we know that peer support works incredibly well. The outcomes are phenomenal. And I remember having a conversation with the Surgeon General's office and being like, who does peer support because it works so well? And they're like, we don't really know. Like, there aren't organizations that really do that very robustly. And so a big part of where we'll be is like what the world needs of us. So as clinicians need education, we want to try to do that. And by the way, we're talking about doing all this stuff. It doesn't mean that we're good at all of it. So we're good at some things for sure. And I think we tend to get better over time. But we start off pretty, we'll start something and then we're not perfect out of the get-go.
Yeah. Well, it's just amazing. The amount of difference that you're making, the amount of people you're helping, the amount of people that you're going to help in the future. I mean, it's just staggering to think about. And who knew when you went on Twitch 5 years ago to talk about, to ramble about something and you're hoping for 5 followers, who knew that it would grow to this? Certainly
not me. And I mean, it could all fall apart in the next, knock on wood, but like we don't, it's, who knows where we'll be in 5 years, maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think it's really about, like you said, focusing on trying. And that's really what we're focused on. I think we've learned this kind of professionally, right? We try to get our patients to focus on trying, and we really try. That's what we do, is we try.
Yeah.
We try to help.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much.
K. And it's always interesting to talk to you. You have a fascinating mind, and there's something inspiring I mean, about talk because your energy is infectious. You have a very, I just feel like, hey, we can do this. When the way that you talk, it just has that motivating element.
Yeah, and I think it's like I received that And I think the thing is, it's not that, I think you just got to be sort of stupid about it. You got to really just focus on the action.
I think it's something about you. I really do. I think it's something about you and your personality, your energy, your passion.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, and we'll talk again at some point. And as I always end every episode, I tell people to take care of themselves, but I also will ask you, why should people take care of themselves, Dr. K?
Because life is fun and good if you know how to live it. But if you don't take care of yourself, your experience of life is going to be way harder, way more suffering. And so, yeah, I think taking care of yourself is a great idea. Because if you're not going to do it, sadly, it's not clear that anyone else will.